When I was in my 20s, I took a job working with high school students. And one of those students was a senior named Cindy. About 3 months before I arrived, Cindy's father had died from lung cancer. He'd been a smoker for 25 years, and then one day when she was 7 years old, he decided he was going to quit. And she was so proud of him for breaking his addiction to nicotine. 10 years goes by, everything seems to be going well, and then one day he feels sick. He goes to the doctor, they do some tests, and they find out that he has tumors in his lungs. Those tumors very quickly metastasized and took over his whole body, and when he eventually succumbed to the cancer, Cindy was absolutely devastated. She was an only child and very close to her dad. The feelings of grief and loss were so overwhelming to her that she eventually began to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. But the thing that really caught me off guard was when Cindy started smoking cigarettes. You would think out of all the things she would do, given the way that she watched her father suffer, the one thing that she wouldn't do is smoke. But she didn't. She embraced the very thing that was the source of all of her pain, almost as if she wanted to suffer the same fate. Over the years, I have come to realize that humans, when it comes to emotions, we are very fragile creatures. We are like pieces of glass that, when handled in the wrong way, can very easily be broken. When an event happens in our lives, and that event causes us to feel emotionally unstable, we want to remedy that feeling. And so what we do is we seek ways to blunt out the pain. And we do this with activities or consuming substances that will lessen or numb the pain out completely. Now, the problem with this approach is that although you feel better in the moment, eventually those feelings are going to resurface. And when they do, they often feel more acute than they did originally. And so you have a choice to make. You can confront the feelings and embrace the discomfort of those emotions, or you can take another dose and suppress the pain. Most people choose suppression. And when this happens, it creates a cycle of pain and suppression, until eventually you've gone so long avoiding your feelings that you've lost the ability to deal with them altogether. Now, if you find yourself in this cycle, I want you to know I'm not judging you. A lot of people operate this way. I know I used to operate this way. So what we're going to be talking about is why we have this propensity to numb ourselves out, not just with drugs, but with all sorts of behaviors. We're going to talk about how we can break this cycle and how we can move forward with our lives rather than just staying in place. And to begin talking about this, I want you to join me in the kitchen. So I want you to imagine that you're living 20,000 years ago in a tribe of hunter-gatherers. And the elders of that community tell you to go out and forage for some food. So you pick a direction and you start walking. And eventually you stumble upon a horde of mushrooms. And you think to yourself, this is big. This could feed dozens of my people for days. So you start collecting all of the mushrooms into your satchel. And as you do so, you start to feel really good, even excited. And this is because your brain is being flooded with dopamine. Now, why is your brain doing this? Well, it's because we evolved this mechanism a long time ago because dopamine helps us remember what we've been doing and enhances memory. Because not only are these mushrooms a really good source of nourishment, but you need to remember how to get back to them. Because you have to remember, in the world you're living in 20,000 years ago, food is not always a guarantee. And this is why something like this grilled cheese sandwich, which has a lot of butter and fat in it, when you eat it, your brain lights up with dopamine and tells you to eat as much as possible because your body wants to store the excess calories as fat just in case you don't get the opportunity to eat again in the future. So you finish gathering up as many of these mushrooms as you can into your satchel, and you look around to make sure that nobody else is watching you. Because even though there's only about 1 million people on the earth at this point in time, you're all competing for the same scarce resources. Seeing nobody, you make your way back to your encampment. And you remember how you got there because there's the dopamine in your brain. And when you get in, you start showing everybody what it is that you found. And they're looking at the mushrooms and they're all super happy. They're patting you on the back, they're smiling at you, which releases more dopamine because that helps you feel bonded to them and they feel bonded to you. And you need that because you rely on each other for safety. That evening, after everyone has enjoyed partaking of your mushrooms, you retreat back into your tent with your partner. The dopamine released during sex feels really good. But even more importantly, the consequence of that rendezvous is that you might have conceived a child. And that's really important because for every child conceived in your day and time, more than half will not make it into adulthood due to miscarriages, disease, and infections. Now, why have I told you this story? Because I want you to appreciate how the chemical architecture of our brains evolved under conditions of scarcity and deprivation. Our brains utilize dopamine to reinforce certain behaviors that are going to help us survive under really difficult conditions by making those activities pleasurable. So, for example, sex is pleasurable because it helps us to reproduce. Spending time with other people is pleasurable because we rely on them for safety. Being able to eat food is pleasurable because it helps us stay alive. And finding that food is even pleasurable because you've solved a puzzle that other people weren't able to solve. You found food that they didn't know existed. The issue is our world is no longer defined by scarcity and deprivation, and the evolutionary architecture of our brains are faltering under the stress. And to explain to you what I mean by this, I want you to join me downstairs. When I was a kid, I had a circuit set just like this one. And my friends and I, we make all kinds of different circuits. Sometimes they'd light up, sometimes they'd make noises. My favorite circuit to make was a wire trip alarm that would go off if my sister tried to get into my room when I wasn't there. I could hear it, so I could come and stop her from doing it. Then, when I was 10 years old, my mom got me a Nintendo Entertainment System, and it absolutely changed my world because it literally flipped a switch in my mind. It was all I could think about, where all I wanted to do was play video games all the time. Without any boundaries on me, I literally would have played all day long. And then a couple of years later, we ended up getting a computer. And that computer, it had really good graphics, and I started playing games on that, and they were better and more realistic. Now, here's the thing though. If I wanted to play those games, I had to be home at a specific time to do it. I had to set aside time in my day. I couldn't just do it whenever I wanted to. Well, then the technology leapfrogged. We got these smartphones. And all of a sudden, things completely changed because It could do all the things that these other devices that we had separately could do. It could play music, you could watch television, you could play games on it, you could communicate. All in high definition, all in the palm of your hand whenever you want it. Now, our brains were not designed for so much stimulation. Our brains are literally still wired the way that they were 20,000 years ago for conditions of deprivation. But our environment has changed dramatically. We have access to endless amounts of food, a lot of it fatty and sugary, the kind that makes our dopamine receptors light up. With the click of a button, not only can we watch a show or play a video game, but we can literally have any item we want delivered to our home. We can play puzzles on our phone. We can gamble. We can indulge our sexual appetite. We are on dopamine overload. Because literally everything we do is designed to extract as much dopamine from us as possible. In fact, we have become so used to this constant flow of dopamine that a good proportion of our society could be classified as functional addicts. Our modern life has become so overly stimulating that spending time with people in the real world is not as pleasurable as it used to be. If you remember what I told you, when we spend time with people in the real world, it releases dopamine. But that's really hard to compete with these high dopamine activities that we utilize today. Now, as a result of this, what you find is that people in industrialized nations like the United States, a quarter of our population spends almost all of their time alone. Did you catch what I just said? Literally a quarter of the population never socializes with anyone. And for those who do socialize, very often they're on their devices while they're spending time with people. This has massive implications for our society and for our mental health. It's no wonder that so many people are reporting that they feel desperately lonely. We've created these dopamine prisons for ourselves with no walls and no bars, and yet we seem incapable of freeing ourselves. Humans were not meant to live this way. And to talk about how we need to change, I want you to join me upstairs. I began this episode by talking about Cindy and how her father passed away from lung cancer. When that happened, the pain and grief she felt was so incredibly intense that she numbed herself out with drugs and alcohol. I told you this story because it illustrates something that's very common among humans, that when we feel really intense emotions, very often if we're given the choice, rather than confront those emotions, we will suppress them. Now, in the past, our options for suppressing our emotions were limited. Only the wealthy could afford to self-medicate continuously with drugs, alcohol, and sex. And even then, there was a social stigma attached to them, so you could only get away with that behavior for so long before people started to judge you. Throughout most of human history, humans, sooner or later, they were going to have to deal with those negative emotions. Fast forward to the present, and every second of our day is consumed with activities and substances that are designed to be able to produce as much dopamine as possible. It is the easiest it has ever been to avoid our feelings. And I'm not just talking about the big stuff, like the death of a loved one. I'm talking about being able to dig yourself into a hole and never feel anything ever, which is super dangerous. Because if you never learn how to manage your emotions, you never really learn how to manage life. So what's the solution? Well, we have to interrupt the constant flow of dopamine. We have to intentionally unplug it and spend time with people in the real world, which, compared to these high dopamine output activities we've devised for ourselves, can feel kind of boring. But like a drug addict who goes to rehab, if you give yourself enough time, eventually your brain will reacclimate.
And when it does, you're going to start to feel again in a way that you haven't in a long time. And depending on what it is that you've been suppressing all that time, it can feel really intense. And this is when you need to reach out to friends, to loved ones, to people who you trust. Because those people are there to help you process your emotions. So often we think of community as just a place for us to socialize. But in reality, our communities are there for us to really help us work through the things that we're feeling. And so this is why if you're isolated and alone and you have nobody to talk to, it's going to be much more likely that you're going to numb yourself out with dopamine to not feel all of those emotions. So here's what I want you to do when you finish watching this video. I want you to put away the screens. I want you to get rid of the distractions, including reading. I want you to put away substances, including food, and I want you to go outside and spend time in nature. Just spend some time outside looking around. If it's not nice outside, look outside the window. The goal is just to be in the quiet. Just spend some time with yourself for a little bit, undistracted. The next thing I want you to do is call a friend and schedule a time to get together. No screens, no distractions, just enjoy the conversation. Try to do this at least once a week, if not more. And I think what you'll find is that when you set aside the distractions and you embrace spending time with people in the real world, all of a sudden your sense of self-awareness is going to grow. You're going to know who you are internally, and your sense of disconnection from the world will be healed. Now, if you don't have anyone, if you're struggling with that, if you don't have anybody to spend time with, you can always join the Kokoro community. We meet every Wednesday beginning January 8th from 7 to 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. And we're here to be a community for everybody who's looking for deep things to think about, but also for people who don't have those connections in their lives. So no matter who you are, no matter where you've been, no matter how you feel, please know that you are loved, you are seen, and you are cared for, if by no one else, by me. My name is Alex Lang. And until next time.